Okay, boys and girls, here we are once again. I want to present some more stats to you on, I suppose you could say, the state of play in the United Kingdom with regards to God belief, religiosity, religious affiliation, all those kinds of things. You will know, I think, that this is something that I do with a fair degree of regularity on this channel, or perhaps you could say a fair degree of frequency and maybe a certain amount of irregularity. It's sort of, I present these things when the information comes along, when there's something new that we can sort of tack on to what we've already talked about. If you're from the UK, this should be of interest to you. If you are not, as I showed you in my video, I showed you the patterns across Europe. Effectively, most countries of Europe are just at different stages of the same procedure, and it could be said that perhaps in the case of the United States of America, they are just at a much earlier stage and possibly likely for once, rather than leading the sort of social change and the countries of Europe responding to the cultural changes in the United States, it may well be the other way around. So it may still be of interest to you. What I want to present for you today, a guy called, I don't know whether it's Jeremy Rodell or Jeremy Rodell, I apologise to him for that, but he's a dialogue officer of Humanists UK, and he gave a presentation, Britain's Religion and Belief Landscape. Now, what I'm not going to do is just wholesale purloin what he had to say and just repeat it all. That would be a little bit unfair. But what I want to do is effectively what he did, which was to take statistics that other people had gathered, other people's work, put it together and make something interesting. I want to go through a few of the bits that he has done, give some commentary on that and make something in addition to what he has done if I can. And I will link you to his study. It is well worth reading. So one of the first things that he says is he quotes quite an interesting quote here from Charles Clarke. If you're in the UK, you may remember he's a former Secretary of State for Education, and Lisa Woodhead, who's a professor of the sociology of religion at Lancaster University, who wrote a paper in 2018. And they headed that paper up with the following statement: "We are living through the single biggest change in the religious and cultural landscape of Britain for centuries, even millennia." And if you are somebody who has followed the videos that I have made on this subject on my channel, you will be aware that what I'm talking about in my lifetime, the changes, the drop-off of affiliation to the Church of England has been nothing short of catastrophic for the Church of England. It is falling off a cliff. It is dying on its arse, effectively there. And the levels of religiosity within the United Kingdom are at a level which is unparalleled, unprecedented within this country, within sort of recorded history. Effectively, and this is happening within a few decades. After glacial change of centuries, this is happening over a few decades. Okay, so what I want to do is he will show you some of these statistics as this goes on. Let me first show you the first graph that Jeremy shows us in this presentation. And what you can see here, it's information that we've gone through before, but it's in a very interesting form that allows us to easily contrast religious affiliation with religiosity. You can see the religious affiliations there. It's put down nuns, Church of England, Catholics, Muslims, the biggest groups, effectively the groups that maybe we're most interested in. And then these very, very usual measures of religiosity, these metrics by which we can measure religiosity: engaging in private prayer, reading scripture in private, attending services, definitely belief in God, higher power, which is an interesting one actually for people from more religious countries. I know that because they've told me before. Some of them struggle to get their heads around just how many people in the United Kingdom profess a religious affiliation and yet don't actually believe in God. We discussed before in an earlier video the 2015 YouGov survey commissioned for the Times, which showed that 55%, only 55% of Christians, when given the choice, do you believe in God, do you believe in a higher power that isn't God, or don't you believe in either God or a higher power, only 55% of Christians said, yep, I believe in God. All right, so I think one thing that shows is the parlour state, really, of Christianity in the UK, not just the Church of England, but Catholicism and beyond, which is really how dissociated much of it has become with the actual business of believing in God. And that also throws into contrast, I think, the difference. I did a video in the past just on Islam and on a study that was conducted into Islam in the UK, and really just how much Islam stands out like a sore thumb, which is in terms of all these metrics, Muslims actually take their shit seriously. And in some ways you have to respect them for that, right? They are a Muslim and they do actually believe in God, right? You've got to respect them for that for some extent. But at the other side of the coin, of course, is for people such as myself who want to see a largely secular society, yes, but also beyond that regard ourselves as anti-theists, by which I mean we believe that a society with less religiosity would be preferable, at least to us, as a society with more religiosity. And so from our perspective, it actually doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or Muslim or whatever, but somebody who actually takes their beliefs very, very seriously is in some ways harder for us to deal with, especially in the public sphere, where we want to discuss subjects on the merit of the science and the actual arguments, rather than somebody just standing their ground, standing firm and saying, that's what my religion says, and so that is my position. Obviously, people who take their religion seriously are harder to deal with than the average Anglican who effectively pays it lip service. And as far as it goes, the average Muslim clearly takes things much more seriously than the average Anglican. That much is beyond doubt. The last thing that I wanted to say with regard to this graph was just to look at the nones, because in some countries, remember what a non means is just that you just do not have a religious affiliation. It doesn't mean that you don't believe in God. And indeed, in some countries like the United States, quite a high proportion of those now who profess not to have a religious affiliation nevertheless still believe in God. You can see in the UK that is not the situation. Only about 5 or 6% of those who regard themselves as non definitely believe in a God or a higher power. Okay, that's pretty much all that I wanted to say with regard to that. The next thing that Jeremy goes on to do is just to make a very key point, because throughout his presentation he takes information largely from the British Social Attitude Survey and also information from the census. It's something that I've mentioned before on this channel. These give quite different numbers, and the reason is, as he's pointed out in this presentation, that the census asks a leading question. It asks, what is your religion? And then it lists them. And the reason is, they've discussed this because they discussed at the last census rephrasing the question. They didn't because they wanted continuity, and also because they said that what local authorities want is to know people's religious affiliation. But effectively, by asking the question that way, that is what you get. You get a strong, people feel, well, it's a kind of leading question. What is your religion? As if you're expected to have a religion, and duly the percentages are higher, but it gives the local authorities what they want with that data. The British Social Attitude Survey does it a different way. It says, do you have a religion or belief? And then it says, if so, which one of them is it? And by asking the question in that different form, it gives a much more balanced perspective. For this next graph, that is the data that's being used, British Social Attitude Survey data. It's data that I've shown before. In fact, it's data that I've made my own graph for before. This is the graph that he is showing here. Let me read you what he has to say, and let me give you my thoughts along the way. Those with no religious identity now comprise about 50% of the population. The growth in that segment is mirrored by the dramatic decline in the Church of England from 40% in 1983 to around 14% now. This is probably driven by a combination of a general move away from religion hitting the main church hard, and the increase in social acceptability in 2017 of denying a religious identity as compared to 1983. But in historical terms, Anglicanism is falling off a cliff. absolutely on board with what he says. Now, what is particularly interesting there is the point that he made that maybe it's become more socially acceptable not to say that you have a religion, or perhaps it wasn't even that it was socially unacceptable, but it was just something that people kind of went along with, and now there's maybe a kind of critical mass of people not associating in that way, and you're getting a kind of second generation effect where people's parents didn't really associate very much with the religion other than at certain times, and now you're at a generation where you're kind of totally beyond that now. But that's a very interesting point that he made there. Another interesting point he makes here. By contrast, the proportion of Catholics has barely declined. This is something we'd noticed before, and as you can see on the graph, but he says this is not because of a lack of attrition, but largely because immigration, notably from Poland, has compensated for the losses. That also makes the Catholic population on average younger than the Anglicans. Now that is very, very, very interesting for me, because we have looked at those stats on this channel before, and we've talked about the stickiness, how likely you are to maintain the religion of your youth, and discussed how Anglicanism seems to be falling off that cliff and Catholicism doesn't, and debated whether it is due to that immigration. As you will see, he actually has some statistics on the stickiness later on in this, and you will see that in actual fact Catholicism follows a very, very similar path to Anglicanism in that regard, and that effectively it is only because of this immigration from Eastern and Middle Europe that accounts for the proportion of Catholics being propped up to this kind of 10% figure along the way. He also points this out. Contrary to the perceptions of many, the actual number of British Muslims remain around 5%. Pew Research forecasts that it will reach 10% by 2050. These figures are far lower than many people's perceptions. According to the Ipsos Mori Perils of Perception Survey 2016, the average perceived size of the current Muslim population is 15%, which is 300% too high. That is very interesting. That take account of what I said earlier on about how people such as I, as anti-theists, may feel about how seriously Muslims take their religion, and contrast that with Anglicans in terms of that. But set that to one side, and also point out the fact that it is only about 5% of the population, and we do kind of build this out of all proportion in some ways. We're talking about a relatively small percentage of the population here, and if you look at the projections, that projected growth is not this skyrocketing figure that some doom mongers will have you believe, and is maybe small enough that we can actually start to leach some of our slightly more secular attitudes, and start decoupling Muslims' religiosity from their religious affiliation in the same way as seems to have taken place with Christianity in the United Kingdom. Okay, let me move on to his next graph. And what he shows here is a graph that's effectively a precursor to talking about future trends, which is obviously something that's very, very interesting. And he shows data again from the British Social Attitude Survey, average over 2014 to 2016, and we've seen the graphs of this shape before. If you watch my recent video, I showed you, I collated the data across Europe and showed you these kinds of graphs for religion versus no religion for different countries across Europe, and showed that the great deal of them are undergoing the same process and often have the same shape graphs. But this is a graph for the UK, which we've discussed before, and you can see the pattern. One thing that Jeremy doesn't point out, which perhaps he should have done, and again he could have got from the British Social Attitude Survey, is that he just assumes it's a cohort effect, rather than the effect that people get more religious as they get older. We know that that isn't the case, because we have the British Social Attitude Survey data from way back to 1983, and we can see that these cohorts, these groups, groups, these age bands, maintain their level of religiosity or irreligiosity as they get older. And so on the basis of that, he can make some kind of future prediction here, because duly you can see the younger the age category, the more likely they are to be part of the no religion, the nones category, and that the big loss has been the Church of England here. It's propped up by people who are 65 years and over, quite frankly, and it's died on its arse by the time you get down to the 15 to 24-year-olds. This is what Jeremy had to say. These were the points that he made. The no religion line will continue to rise. Over 60% of under 35s fall into this category, and nearly 70% of 15 to 24s. It includes a clear majority of parents of school-age children, and of course that only adds to the effect, right? It's not just that people are losing the religion of their parents, but also people are growing up in households where religion plays little or no part, and so it seems to be very, very much a one-way train here. It's hard to see it coming back. The Church of England is likely to continue in its precipitous decline. Only 4% of the under 35s identify with it, compared to 36% of the 75 and overs. It's hard to see a way back for the Church of England, which of course this is a really, really important thing in terms of our heritage, in terms of the churches and the cathedrals, things which most of us, even those of us of no religion, don't want to see fall to dust. We'd like to see these things maintained, of course, even if we don't have the religion. And also, as we'll talk about later in the report, the ways in which the Church of England has its teeth into the United Kingdom as a state. That's got to come into question as these people who are religious are dying off, and they're not going to be replaced because this is a cohort effect. The Catholic line is liable to stay flat, though the decline at youngest age groups suggests it may slip longer term. It will slip longer term unless immigration props it up, so I think that's largely what's going to define the Catholic Church on that particular point. The Christian no-denomination line seems likely to plateau at around 12%, and the Muslim Islam population will continue to grow, I think partly due to birth rates, partly due to the greater degree of stickiness, and partly due to immigration is why he makes that particular claim. He then goes on to say something which was very, very interesting. This is what he said. Not only are numbers identifying with non-mainstream Pentecostal evangelical churches growing, but, as Linda Woodhead and Greg Clark say in their LSE blog post, How Anglicans Tipped the Brexit Vote, evangelicalism is increasingly influential amongst bishops and senior clergy in the Church of England, but appeals to only a minority of the laity. Over time, as older, more traditional Anglicans die out and the C of E continues its precipitous decline, that balance may change. In the process, the C of E will shift from a moderate religion of the people to a more sectarian religion for an evangelical minority. There will not be much non-evangelical Protestantism left. Why is that important? Now, superficially, you may look at that and think, well, does it really matter if the Church of England is evangelical and thereby much more devout, right? And maybe with attitudes of religiosity metrics more in line with the Muslim population than the present Church of England population. Does that really matter if it's only going to be 4 or 5 or 10% of the population? It wouldn't do if it wasn't for the fact that it is the state religion and has all the controls and all its fingers still in all these different state pies that it has now. It is bad enough, that situation as is, but if it was a group of people who are, in terms of their religiosity, very different to the present incumbents, holding those wheels of power, then I think that gives the rest of us real cause for concern. Why should a tiny minority of very fervent religious people have that special treatment within our democracy? That is a question that we're going to have to ask ourselves. Okay, on to the next graph. And the next graph is a very, very interesting one because it deals with this issue of stickiness. And you know, whenever I read a new report or a new study or a new piece of information, presentation such as this, there always needs to be something within it that triggers something in my head that says, yes, this is worth an additional video on this topic. And it was this graph, it was the information in this graph when I got to this that made me thought, wow, this is something different. This is something really, really fascinating. Because what it is showing, it's confirming some of the things that we've talked about before on this channel. You can see that the business here, let's look at the Anglican column just to see where we're at. So if people brought up in an Anglican household, what it is suggesting, brought up with Anglicanism, about 50% of them maintain their Anglicanism, 40% of them end up having no religion whatsoever. Now, that was kind of expected. In fact, I would have perhaps expected to that be even a little bit greater than that. But what is more interesting is when you look at the Catholics there. I thought that was going to potentially be very different. After all, we've seen the graphs in terms of religiosity, in terms of private prayer, church attendance, etc. You can see that they are all quite a bit greater for the Catholics than they were for the members of the Church of England, the Anglicans. But you can see that actually it doesn't make a great deal of difference in terms of the stickiness. Right, you still got only about the same percentage, just over 50% of Catholics. You brought up a Catholic, but they're almost as flaky, quite honestly, as the Anglicans. You still have 37% versus 41% of them ending up with no religion. So I thought that was really kind of illuminating there. And again, we have the non-Christians, so that's largely made up of Muslims, but also with a fair smattering of Sikhs and Hindus and people, of course, of other religions, much, much, much stickier. Now, why would that be? It doesn't tell you why here, but I can imagine there are a number of factors. With regard to all these religions, of course, there is the cultural factor of effectively perhaps a greater amount of cultural identity and a greater amount of cultural insularity. You are part of a smaller, more insular group rather than being part of the mainstream, secular, non-religious stroke Christian group, because like I say, this is sort of so low in terms of religiosity that you can hardly get a cigarette paper in many cases between the Anglicans and the Catholics and the people who have no religion. So there's a greater period of differentiation there. And perhaps that brings that religious affiliation is that much stronger. But there are maybe also other cultural factors, particularly with regard to Islam. It's simply not as socially acceptable if you're a Muslim to abandon your faith. Quite honestly, if you're a young Muslim and you tell your mother that you're coming out as an atheist, you may as well have fucking crapped in her handbag. It's going to go down like a lead balloon. Let's be honest, we hear about it, we've seen stats before. There was a notorious survey conducted, I think, by the Telegraph quite some years ago, about 15 years ago now, which showed that something like 30% of young British Muslims believed that the penalty for apostasy from Islam should be death. Now, it's not to say they would carry it out themselves, but that they subscribe to that philosophy. That philosophy is going to make it a much more harder environment to leave your religion, and duly those non-Christians is a much more sticky group. But and this is, maybe there ought to be a sort of drum roll here, the stickiness award goes to those with no religion, which from my perspective is a tremendous positive here. Of those brought up with no religion, 94% of those maintain having no religion. And I think that shows that in terms of our society, I mean, when I talk about it being a positive, look at it this way. The largest growth group here in the United Kingdom by a large margin is the no religious group, and it doesn't seem like there is an easy path backwards, that effectively once religion has gone out of a household and of one's descendants, that there is not an obvious way for religions to win people back in the modern society. Let me quote you here what Jeremy quotes. He says, Stephen Bullivant says in the Catholic Research Forum report, Contemporary Catholicism in England and Wales, it can be derived from these data that for every one Catholic convert in England and Wales, 10 cradle Catholics no longer identify as Catholics. For every one convert to Anglicanism, 12 cradle Anglicans now no longer identify as Anglicans duly. There is very little for these people to crow about. That even in terms of those people converting to those religions, for everyone they gain, they're losing them hand and fist in terms of older Catholics and Anglicans dropping off the end, dying of old age, and not being replaced by young Catholics and Anglicans. Now, the situation might not be quite the same in religions like Islam, where the religion is more sticky itself, and also by dint of having a small population, like 96% of the population is available to convert to Islam, and only 4% of the population is available to lose that religion. So you would maybe expect a different balance of flux there, but nevertheless, the stickiness amongst the non-religion group is higher than even the stickiest of religions in the UK. Now, what I want to do next is to skip a little bit and to move to the point where he starts to talk about his conclusions. What are the challenges and responses? Because I want to give my little thoughts on what he has to say with regard to that. So here we are, and what Jeremy does in the lead up to this is that he just presents us with this graph, extrapolating the data from the younger people and sort of showing this where this will be not too far in the future, in about 20 years, 2040, and it shows that the no-religion group has gone up to 63%. And Julie, the Christian percentage, the Church of England's down at 4%. The Muslim population has grown, but only to about 8%. It's gone from about 5% to 8% there. The non-Christian denominations have grown to about 13%. This is what he has to say with regard to that and with regard to these changing demographics. Most notably, I suppose, the decline of the Church of England. This is what he says. As quoted in my LSE Religion and Global Society blog post, What Do Secularists Mean by Secularism? Andrew Copson's 2017 book, Secularism, Politics, Religion and Freedom, defines secularism using 3 principles from the work of French historian and sociologist of secularism. Oh dear, I'm going to show my lack of ability to pronounce foreign names here. Jean Boubereau. That might be quite good, actually. I might have made quite a good fist of that. These are the 3 principles. 1, separation of religious institutions from the institutions of state, which we don't have in the UK, by the way, and no domination of the political sphere by religious institutions. 2, freedom of thought, conscience and religion for all, with everyone free to change their beliefs and manifest their beliefs within the limits of public order and the right of others. And 3, no discrimination against anyone on the grounds of their religion or non-religious worldview, with everyone receiving equal treatment on these grounds. I think that they are admirable secular principles, and I subscribe to those. But of course, it must be borne in mind that whilst we can all uphold people's rights to their own religion and their religious principles, the simple fact is that the very nature of some religious principles makes it seem almost an absurdity to say that you can hold that principle and yet uphold the principles of secularity, because they fly in the face of the principles of secularity. Because the point is that for a lot of people, their religion just does not just apply to the self, but it mandates them, it demands that they apply it to other people. And you can understand why. After all, if you said to me, I'm going to murder my 3-year-old child, right, I wouldn't just say, well, that's fine. I'm not going to murder mine, but that's fine if you want to murder yours, right? Because that's not how it works. When we think of certain things as immoral, we don't just think, well, I think it's immoral, but if you want to crack on with it, that's up to you. And obviously some religious people are going to feel the same. If you genuinely, just to give you an example, if you genuinely believe that abortion is murdering a human being, why would you not feel compelled to try and stop other people from having abortions? We can promote the idea that everybody should be able to decide for themselves in these things. And if you're a religious person and you're against abortion, then that's up to you, and you don't have to have abortions, and you're entitled to your opinion, but don't impose it on other people. But simply speaking, if that religious person really genuinely believes, as some religious people do, that what is happening is tantamount to murder, then it's kind of an absurd thing to make, an absurd claim to make, because of course somebody is going to want to impose their positions on everybody else if that is what they believe. If they believe that effectively this is a serious moral issue, it's going to extend beyond the self. And this is the problem that we are finding in modern societies, is that we want to uphold these different rights for different groups. We want to uphold the rights for homosexuals, we want to uphold the rights for religious people, but sometimes they just do not mesh. And this is a difficult situation that we find ourselves in a modern secular society. This is what Jeremy goes on to say, and I think this is a really, really good piece here, and I will intersperse it with my thoughts there. And then that pretty much wraps up the video. This is what he goes on to say, talking about those principles of secularism. This seems the only fair basis for our plural society. We already have freedom of religion or belief and equality enshrined in law. This is in the UK. If not always in practice. But, and these are fairly large buts, the head of state is still the head of the Church of England, an institution with which less than 5% of people under 35 identify. Let me stop what he's saying there, because absolutely, already we're on a very, very important point here. And a kind of a bit of an absurd point here, which is that if less than 5% of people under 35 identify, that means that even if the present future incumbent Prince William regards himself as an Anglican, there is an increasingly diminishingly small chance that future heads of state after him will regard themselves as Anglicans. So we're going to end up in this absurd position here, where our head of state, and I say this as a monarchist, right? I am a dyed-in-the-wool monarchist. I'm not saying as this is a Republican. We will end up in a situation where our head of state is not an Anglican, but they are the head of the Church of England. They might not even be a Christian. They might not believe in God. They may regard themselves as a card-carrying atheist, for Christ's sake, and they are still the head of state for the Church of England. This is a situation that I think we need to untangle ourselves from before we end up with an absurdity. I think we should all be allowed. One of those principles of secularism is that you ought to be able to have your religion or no religion and declare it freely. I think that should also apply to the head of state. The head of state should not have to pretend to be an Anglican if they are not. And there is no incongruity with keeping our system as a constitutional monarchy such as it is, with all the checks and balances and constitutional reasons why we may wish to do that, and untangling that monarchy from the Church of England. That is the first thing there. The second thing is, he says, uniquely among democratic countries, 26 seats in the legislature, the House of Lords, are reserved for Church of England bishops. We still have that system in our bicameral system in the upper chamber. Bishops, religious figures, get to sit there purely on the grounds that they are religious figures. They are the Lord's spiritual, and that seems an absurdity. We have had reforms. We have had reforms of the House of Lords. What is an absurdity? Do you know who is the biggest defender of the Lord's spiritual, those 26 bishops? It isn't the Church of England. It isn't the Catholics. It's British Muslims. People have been surveyed on this. It's actually British Muslims, even though these are Christians there, they'd rather see Christians in the House of Lords than see the non-religious in there. That tells you something, that they are bigger defenders of this than the actual Church of England. People who regard themselves as affiliated to the Church of England, at least themselves. That is something that really needs to change. Something that I have suggested in the past. I have no problem. I am somebody who in many ways is quite conservative in terms of our constitution, and I like to see these parts of our constitution and our culture maintained. I have no problem with the Lord's spiritual, but why not expand the Lord's spiritual? Scrap it being 26 bishops. Why not have an array of people of a philosophical bent who know about moral philosophy, who know about the ethics of medicine, for example? You could scrap this, have a couple of bishops, have a couple of imams, have a couple of representatives from the Catholic Church, a representative of the Jewish community, Hindu community, Sikh community, some humanists within there, and then have some retired professors of philosophy, of ethics and of medical ethics, etc., etc. Why don't we utilize those 26 slots rather than having 26 blowhard bishops, right, who are just representing what will effectively become 4 or 5% of the population? That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever there. Christianity carries on, remains embedded in public life, from remembrance ceremonies to prayers in Parliament. More significantly, a large and still growing number of state-funded schools are run by religious organisations, principally the Church of England and the Catholic Church, but also now Muslim, Jewish, Sikh and Hindu groups. If there is competition for places, these state schools are legally allowed to discriminate against children on the basis of their parents' faith or lack of it, with resultant social selection. These things need to change. Hallelujah! Right? They absolutely do. The situation, I've detailed it before, about a third of state-funded schools. Right, this isn't a third of schools. These aren't private schools paid for by the churches. These are state-funded schools that my taxes go to ensuring that Catholic parents and Church of England parents get more choices than I do because they subscribe to one of these religions. It's like taking the 3 lanes of the motorway and saying one of these lanes from now on is only going to be for Catholics. It's like taking all the NHS hospitals and saying a third of those hospitals are only going to be for Anglicans, despite them being funded by the state. So Anglicans will have more choice than everybody else. Catholics can have a free lane on the motorway when the other 2 lanes are entirely crowded. It is absurd. It is beyond absurd. And in some towns in the United Kingdom, there is only one secondary school, and that school is a faith school, for crying out loud. That is an absolute abhorrence in a modern society such as our own, and it is an even greater abhorrence is how little political will there is to challenge this, when the Conservative government had a policy which fortunately they were forced to abandon, to increase the number of grammar schools and increase the number of state-funded faith schools, right? People were more up in arms about the fucking grammar schools than they were about the faith schools. They were more concerned about pupils being selected on the grounds of academic ability, which is at least relevant, than they were on pupils being selected on the grounds of what religion their parents have in a state-funded school. Jesus Christ. Okay, this is how it goes on. But at the same time, freedom of religion or belief must be strongly defended, provided the rights of others are not eroded. Religious people must be as free as anyone to seek public office and argue from their convictions. And the Archbishop of Canterbury must be able to argue for political change on the basis of his faith and as leader of his organisation, but the argument should be given the same weight in the public square as anybody else. I agree with that as a principle, absolutely. And there is nothing that I can object to with regard to a religious person arguing on the basis of their religious convictions. But it isn't particularly helpful, quite frankly. If we're having a debate on abortion, right, and most of us in the room are having a debate on the grounds of looking at the fetus and what does the science say about the fetus at different stages of development, and there's somebody in the room who says, well, I think abortion's wrong because it says in the Bible or because God thinks it's wrong, right, that's just a conversation killer. And the problem is that a lot of religious people who are minded like that hide behind the secular arguments. In other words, they will rely on the science and the secular arguments to try and convince you, but that isn't what their position is based upon. Their position, it's like a Mott and Bailey tactic. Their position is based on something far more fundamental. You can only lose to them. You can never win to them. If they win the scientific case or manage to persuade you, then that's fine. But there is literally nothing that you can say that will persuade them, because the arguments that they're making are not what their position is based upon. Their position is based upon their belief in God and what they think God wants them to believe, what God says is moral. So I agree with what Jeremy has to say there, but notwithstanding that, I still find people who have a very, very strong religious perspective as a negative, quite frankly, in terms of the public square, because it's much harder to have a discussion on common grounds. If we could all agree, well, the issue of abortion just depends on whether God exists or not, so let's just discuss God for an hour, and then those that don't believe in God can be pro-choice, and those that do believe in God could be pro-life. If it was as simple as that, it wouldn't be a problem, but it just doesn't run down those lines. Okay. Little bit of discussion there. Really interesting presentation that this guy prepared. I've left a lot of it out because I didn't just want to, like I say, purloin what he'd done, but I've added a certain amount of commentary myself. And don't forget that stickiness factor in there, which we didn't know about, or I didn't know about if you watch my videos. Those were things that were open for discussion, certainly with relation to Catholics. It turns out that Catholics are just as fucking flaky, at least in the United Kingdom, as everybody else. Okay, thank you if you've watched this far. I hope you've got something out of this video. I will link the report. I will also link some of my other videos on this subject, so you can go back and have a look at the stats that are in them and get a bigger picture about the situation both in the UK, across Europe, and also in the United States. Okay, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.